Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is part 2 of a Middle East edition of City Talk. Like all good serial soap operas, we'll take a moment to review last week's show. We talked about the U.S. role in the Middle East now and in the future. We talked about Iraq, its problems and prospects, Iran, confrontation or communication, and Saudi Arabia and oil. Joining me once again to talk about the Middle East, its problems and prospects, and U.S. policy in the region is a distinguished Middle East hand, Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Syria, the Philippines, and Mauritania. He has served as U.S. Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Asian Affairs and has been named Korea U.S. Ambassador. He was a senior fellow for the Middle East at the Council on Foreign Relations for 15 years. Ambassador Murphy is a frequent TV commentator and widely consulted expert. Welcome back, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you.
One of the topics that I didn't get to last week was the issue of Iraqi refugees and what impact that might have on the region, which flows into our discussion today. What numbers, distribution, potential impacts?
The major recipient countries of Iraqi refugees are Jordan and Syria. And Syria has taken several 100,000 more than Jordan. They're a terrific burden on the services that those countries can provide in terms of health, education, and general economic pressures. Some of them came out of Iraq with money, but that money's been drawn down and not replenished in most cases. Internal to Iraq, there's been displacement, sort of ethnic cleansing of formerly mixed neighborhoods in Baghdad are now more Sunni or more Shia as the pressures, the political pressures and the violence was at such heights. You didn't dare stay in your house if you were isolated from your
Let me just interrupt for a second. So you're telling me that the decrease in violence that we've seen in Iraq in part is a result of the success of ethnic displacement and ethnic cleansing, quote unquote?
In part,
Okay.
probably not the whole thing.
Okay.
The growing effectiveness of the Iraqi security forces working with the Americans, the effect of the awakening of the Sunni, they realized that they had other fish to fry than fighting against the government. So, but it's been part of it, sure. Okay. There aren't, if that neighbor who was either a mistrusted Shia or a terrible Sunni is gone, that's removed some of the provocations. So you've got both external and internal refugees. Yeah. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, how do you get back to normal? If I, as a Sunni in Baghdad, want to go back to my neighborhood or my home, maybe the security is good enough, but I'm going to be throwing out what I would consider a squatter in my home. And that's a continued source of deep friction, will be a continuing one. Outside, the folks are under pressure to go back, the Iraqi refugees. Nobody sees the value in having several 100,000 refugees on their hands. Jordan, that's been carrying the heavy load with the Palestinian refugees over the decades, has accepted, now is having to close its borders to all but people who can prove that they'll be economically self-sufficient. And even in Syria, you find programs, an effort to encourage them to go away, go home. And their kids can't get equal treatment in the schools. There just aren't the spaces.
So do these folks then ultimately represent a potential threat to those two regimes, for example, if they can't go back, assuming that the violence and the conflict it continues in Iraq, they don't go back, what happens?
Well, it will be seen. It can increase lawlessness, people getting desperate. There have been some pretty lurid articles about middle-class Iraqi families seeing their daughters go into prostitution in Damascus circles, Amman circles, because there's no other income for the family. I mean, that was not a scene, not an issue before the war, before the invasion.
So this is going to be a problem now and in the future, irrespective of what happens.
And it's a problem the world can do something about. Both governments are now open to assistance programs, be it school supplies, food, or financial assistance tied directly to refugee relief.
Okay. Before we get to the countries, involved with the refugee problem, and also Israel and Palestine, I just want to briefly turn to Afghanistan. Again, sort of a discussion that we began last week. The word is that the war on terror really should be focused on Afghanistan. We've had Obama say it. We've had McCain say it. What does it look like on the ground in Afghanistan, and is moving military forces from Iraq into Afghanistan the answer or an answer?
Part of the answer will be a more substantial, what they call robust military force, still under NATO auspices.
Go ahead.
Frankly, I get nervous during these last weeks of the campaign that the candidates don't oversell victory is going to be ours in Afghanistan with a greater military investment. Afghanistan, more than any other country I know, is so decentralized and so resistant to outsiders coming to run them, to rule them, to imperialize. We're coming to develop them, and that's not believed by most. We're the outsiders. So I think that it's tricky in the context of taking a stand critical of the Bush administration and its handling of Iraq, that you don't fall over the other side and say, hey, but he neglected Afghanistan, and now we're going to fix that and fix everything by a greater military investment. It's an economic development seen first and foremost.
So you have the potential, I think you're suggesting, of quagmire too in Afghanistan, because the terrain is at least as difficult in a sense as it was and has been in Iraq.
There must be a better word than quagmire because it's largely desert, but still.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, this is
you're getting stuck.
Getting stuck. You're getting stuck.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Israel and Palestine. Where are we in the peace process? You're not going to have a treaty by the end of 2008, as we speculated 7 months ago. Where are we? And there's a real. It looks like we're in stasis here.
At the very best, and Secretary Rice has made a personal investment in terms of 10 trips this year, perhaps, to the area.
I know.
At the very best, I think, will be a very general statement of principles, none of which will be new or startling to the participants or to the world, talking about a two-state solution, talking about a need for getting to final status issues of borders, of the status of the refugees. I don't know if they'll be able to say any words about the status of Jerusalem as a joint capital, because that's poison in certain Israeli political circles, and that's inhibited Prime Minister Olmert since he started efforts with Abbas on the Palestinian side. So I don't think there's going to be much to point to with pride. And the message, if the new team is ready, I hope they will be, is that if you're going to try to do something positive on the Arab-Israeli scene, the president's got to be involved from day one. There is such a reality that momentum has to be created and sustained. He has to be tough, he has to be committed, and he has to stay with the problem. I mean, it can be done through the secretary, but the players out there have to realize it matters to him, and that he accepts the argument that certainly you've heard from the Arab world for years now, that this is poisoning the American relationship in the region. This is still the touchstone of problems that they see that Washington could do a better job at managing.
But they still see the United States as a critical or the critical player?
I would say yes, because, you know, we've been bemused by the role the Turks have apparently undertaken between the Syrians and the Israelis.
As intermediaries.
As intermediaries, but I think the Turks themselves would be quick to tell you, this is a holding game until you Americans come in.
Okay, so again, as in Iraq, in a sense, we're in a holding pattern, waiting for at least the outcome of the American election, if not the swearing in of the president.
And you're also waiting in Israel for a new government, an election in Israel. The leadership on the Palestinian side is aging, and the question is there going to be any reconciliation within their camp between Hamas and Fatah? And a lot of issues.
An awful lot of issues. You know, we tend to think of it simplistically as, you know, Arab Israel, Palestinians, and the Israelis. But as you point out, you've got Gaza under the control of Hamas, and you've got the West Bank under the control of Fatah, and they had bitter and violent confrontations.
Unless there's some reconciliation.
You're not giving me any hope here.
Well, I didn't come for that purpose.
Okay. Where is the hope?
The hope is that there can be a reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. There again, what can we do about that? Well, we've labeled Hamas as terrorists and we're never going to talk to them. We're never going to deal with them. Well, let's revisit that. We cannot afford to play that kind of game in the very intricate, complex situation that is Middle East political life.
Okay. One of the more recent stumbling blocks, or not more recent, ongoing, is a surge in settlement on the West Bank. You've got all kinds of aggravating activity coming, you know, happening on the ground and in a sense below the radar. What are the things that are working against a change in the relationships, either on the ground or the United States involvement?
Well, the power of the settler movement, a very small percentage of Israeli citizens involved in the settler movement, but they operate like a laser, cutting through one Israeli administration after another, and unopposed except rhetorically opposed. They keep hearing speeches by the political leaders, be they Labour or Likud leaders, that there are legal settlements and there are illegal settlements, and they're deaf to that kind of argument. They see it as, you know, a God-given land that they will maintain.
What makes them hear? Or how do you change their behavior if they don't listen to you?
Well, it's a tough one, because it means eventually that there has to be a government in Israel ready to take on, with economic incentives, but with force, that very small element of its own population, force if necessary.
And looking at the current leadership of Likud, the Labour Party, and Kadima, is that at all likely? Who is there a leader or a party in Israel that would do such a thing or could do such a thing?
I don't see it, but it doesn't mean they're not there. There's certainly a majority of Israelis who want a comprehensive peace settlement with the Arabs and with the Palestinians, including the Palestinians. But when you ask that question, okay, who's going to stand up and be the standard bearer, it's very hard to spot the individual, even a major party, ready to tackle the issue
and then
of settlements.
Looking at the other side, you've got violently divided leadership and factions, with Hamas and Fatah controlling two different areas, Gaza and the West Bank. Abbas is weak. Can the Palestinians fulfill sort of their side of the bargain, and that is to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure? Or is this, I mean, this is both sides of the line where there are weaknesses and real problems, maybe even more so on the Palestinian side?
Well, look, we don't hear much about the Egyptian role in Middle East politics these days.
Go ahead.
And there wasn't a time when everything was what Egypt says, Egypt thinks is going to happen,
right?
And
they
change
become
it.
Really almost peripheral.
But the fact is, in a situation like Hamas, there would not be a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas today if it hadn't been for months and months and months of very steady, patient Egyptian pressures. So they have played a positive role on that. And they, a ceasefire should be seen as giving one the precious time to work out a new understanding between Palestinians and, God willing, between Palestinians and Israelis. Because it's very hard to convince any Israeli government that if there are continuing acts of violence, that there's any goodwill whatsoever over there on the other side.
Is there a belief, you have been to the Middle East since our last conversation, is there a perception among the folks there that there is this ability to move and that the United States has both the will and the skill to do so?
I repeat, I think the majority are looking for a peaceful settlement. And the answers to the individual differences or conflicts have been worked out. They are there. It is a question of political will in the Palestinian and the Israeli camps to work towards those answers. And I don't think we should be claiming the great credit for it, but there have been moments such as 67, 73, 74, the last months of the Clinton administration, when answers were refined and presented across the divide. So there's no great discovery to be made about what should be done and ways how that could be done. But you ask about who's going to do it, I don't have the answer on that.
Looking at the positions of both McCain and Obama on Israel and Palestine, there doesn't seem to be much difference. It seems as if they might be happier with McCain, and Obama is an unknown, and there's sort of this, what you've called a free-floating anxiety about change.
The unknown, and
right.
I think that puts it very well that the Obama has been challenged for not being explicit enough about his support for Israel. I think it's on the record. He's been fully explicit on that grounds. But it's the unknown. And the Israelis are not easy folks to deal with. Everything becomes an existential challenge to them. Every proposal we've had
literally their existence as they see it. And rightly so.
In some cases, rightly so, perhaps in others, less justifiably.
Okay.
So, but the fact is they don't know Obama as they know McCain, and it's the unknown that worries them. They ran a poll a few months ago, and McCain was clearly the favored candidate, I think, and Hillary when she was still in the race. Yeah. Obama, who is he?
Right. Would you expect a diplomatic surge, if you will, in the area by the Middle East with the accession of a new president?
It's something I would very much hope for, because I think American interests are very important in that area, and a peaceful resolution or a peaceful management. If we can't get a solution to given problems, we can certainly help work out a live and let live arrangement among many of the combatants. One
of the things that seems clear, though, over the last several years is that the Bush administration's argument that the road to Jerusalem led through Baghdad certainly hasn't been the case.
It was nonsense to begin with, and it's been discredited. People resist the idea that the Arab-Israeli, particularly Israeli-Palestinian situation, is the root cause of the problems in the area. I have to be careful in
You're a diplomat.
affirming that. No, I'm just careful thinking of my own past, that's what I'd worked on so much, was Israeli-Palestinian, and Arab contacts were forever saying, look, solve this and you got it made in the Middle East. That was too easy, too simple as a formula, but I can't shake the assumption that a better relationship out there, progress towards a settlement, would start to transform our relationships throughout the region. Even Osama, remember, his first target was the Saudi royal family.
Sure.
Get rid of them, it'll be better. His second target was get the Palestinians their land and their justice. So it's been animating a lot of ill will towards the United States that we have done comparatively little towards getting
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but or the fact of Iraq, in a sense, does that make the Israeli-Palestinian issue less central because we've created another problem, if you will?
We're going to be leaving Iraq as a military force sooner rather than later. So the other problem will remain. Iraqis are going to, there'll probably be another spate of bloodletting in Iraq. I don't think we can stop that. The animosities are still very sharp. But to be working on the Arab-Israeli situation and managing what we can, counseling what we can to the Iraqis, that it'd be better to find a way to live side by side than to engage in a civil war, which doesn't seem as imminent today as it did 2-3 years back. The surge did help, yes, but it didn't solve the problem, and it may have just postponed another bloodletting.
Okay, let's move to the neighbors, which we began addressing earlier in your conversation about the refugees. Syria is, it seems to be at least a bit breaking out of its diplomatic isolation, and in part it seems to be motivated by economics. Could you talk about what's going on in Syria and the relationship of Syria with the Israelis? Because as you mentioned, they're talking with each other through the Turks. What is that relationship?
Well, I think Syria has, from all the years I've known it, like to feature that it's the leader of resistance. They're the most principled Arab nation in the Arab-Israeli conflict. No compromises, justice for the Palestinians, full return of lands occupied, etc. That's our program. That said, Syria doesn't enjoy being the pariah that it's become over the years. Bad relations with just about everybody in the Arab world, anchor to windward with the Iranians, but that doesn't make them that popular given the animosity towards Iran felt and suspicions felt by much of the Arab world. And even in their own country, they're a majority of Sunni Arab. Now,
in Iran?
In Syria.
In Syria,
in Syria, yeah. Syria would like to get out of that isolation, but of course it wants to do it on its own terms. And the sort of deal that they've proclaimed they were ready for was a peace negotiation that would return every last inch of the land occupied in 1967 and 73. Yeah. Now, what Syria's been unable to do over the years, and there's a very interesting book out just this past summer by Aaron Miller called Much Too Promised Land, which I hope you get a chance to look at one day.
Before the next interview, go ahead.
Well, that's easily done. It's a good read. But what it does say is that Syria never was able to put on the table confidence-building moves. It talked about peace, and Bashar al-Assad, son of the late president, has now been in power for 8 years. He has been even more forward-leaning than his father was, who came to that point late in his life, that there wouldn't be just an end to belligerency, but there could be peace. But they've been very reluctant to put out specifics of what they would do, what would happen in trade, what would happen in tourism, what would happen, what does peace mean? And that's what the Israelis have been sitting with arms folded. Okay, what do you mean? You're asking us for something specific, you're giving just generalities.
And is this likely to change?
Well, that's what should be explored. And we have not been playing a very positive role in that area by being very skeptical about the value of talks. We were not apparently on board with the Israeli-Syrian overtures that the Turks have gotten going. I say test them. Test if one side or the other or both are bluffing, let's establish that. But you won't do that by discouraging the contacts themselves. And as I said, I think the Turks are really doing something that is a holding action pending American re-engagement.
Now, with the explicit or tacit support of the United States in terms of these activities and talks?
No, I think they started without involving us. I have no evidence that the Turks quietly came to us and asked permission to get something going. I think they have their own their own ambitions and interests in the Middle East.
Okay, the last country I want to look at specifically before I go to a more general question is Lebanon. Again, you've got, it seems, a cooling of the atmosphere, and you've got the parliamentary elections in 2009. But since our last discussion, you had Hezbollah overrunning parts of Beirut. A new government was formed in July, which essentially gives Hezbollah and its allies veto power over the government.
All true. The military confrontation overrunning Beirut lasted a couple of days, and it left a bad taste, and it kind of weakened the Hezbollah case that we exist only to liberate all of Lebanon's land and help defend the country against Israel. There were Hezbollah forces, troops with guns, and there were Lebanese factions, and the army said, don't involve us. If you want to keep an army, we'll stay out of it.
So it's status quo, sectarian fighting.
It dented Hezbollah's image, though, and its message that follow us because we are the only true patriots. We'd never raise arms against a fellow citizen.
Okay,
they did.
They're giving me a signal, but I have to ask this question. Condoleezza Rice's legacy as Secretary of State?
In the Middle East, minimal.
None.
Well, a bad joke was made about the rice bowl is not very full in the Middle East.
Ooh, okay. This has been the second of a two-part conversation with Ambassador Richard Murphy, and part of our ongoing investigations of some of the major issues confronting the United States as it's about to choose a president. Join us. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.